He was at a private fundraiser in the Hamptons when he said it. Speaking to an audience of Republican donors in Southampton, New York, the Vice President of the United States described the Prime Minister of Canada as a very sweet guy, and then he laughed. Because apparently, JD Vance found it genuinely hilarious that Mark Carney had been walking into negotiations with Donald Trump and, in Vance's telling, puffing his chest out and saying he was going to out-tough the most powerful man in the world. Hilarious, Vance said. It was hilarious because fundamentally, they climbed down on a lot of issues. The room laughed with him, and the fundraiser moved on. And the audio that had been recorded at that private event by a source who attended, audio obtained and published by the Canadian press, was about to become the most consequential leak in the entire history of the Canada-United States trade war. Not because of what Vance said, but because of what happened next. Within 48 hours of Vance declaring Carney's toughness hilarious, Mark Carney suspended trade negotiations with the United States entirely, directed his negotiators to return to Ottawa, imposed dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs on American goods, and issued a statement saying the deal had become untenable because the United States had asked too much and offered too little. The man Vance called a very sweet guy who always climbed down had just walked away from the entire negotiation. The man Vance said it was hilarious to watch try. To out-tough Trump had just done exactly that. And the 50% tariffs that were supposed to bring Canada to its knees are now being matched dollar for dollar by Canada going the other direction. Vance mocked Carney on Wednesday. By Friday night, Carney had turned the tables in a way that no amount of Hampton fundraiser laughter could have anticipated. This is the full story of how that happened, what it reveals about both men, and why the leaked audio that was supposed to embarrass a Canadian Prime Minister may have done something entirely different. Start with the audio itself, because the content and the context matter equally. Vance was speaking on Wednesday, August 19th, the same day that Trump had announced a 3-day pause on the 50% tariffs, claiming a deal was imminent. The mood in Washington at that moment was one of cautious optimism. Canadian negotiators were still in the capital. LeBlanc and Greer were still talking. The 3-day pause existed precisely because both sides believed, or at least said they believed, that a deal was close. And into that moment of apparent progress, Vance was at a private fundraiser for young Republicans in one of the wealthiest zip codes in America, describing the Canadian Prime Minister's negotiating posture as comedy. The comments were not careful diplomatic assessments. They were the kind of insider mockery that politicians deploy when they believe they are speaking privately, when the room is friendly, and when the point is to make an audience of. Supporters feel like they are getting the unvarnished truth about how things really work. Carney thinks he's tough. It's hilarious. He climbs down every time. The Jamil Jivani dimension of the Vance audio adds a layer that was almost lost in the coverage focused on the mockery of Carney. But that reveals something important about how the American side understood the Canadian political landscape and how it was attempting to navigate it. Vance praised Jivani, the Conservative MP, who is a longtime personal friend of the Vice President dating back to their shared time at Yale Law School, as a pretty effective advocate for Canada, particularly on energy and automobile tariffs. Vance said Jivani had been quietly inserting himself in discussions between the two countries, identifying areas where American and Canadian interests could align to produce what Vance called win-win outcomes. Vance's own involvement in the Canada file, he indicated, had been greater than typical because of his personal relationship with Jivani. The picture that emerged from the audio was of the Vice President of the United States having a closer and warmer relationship with a backbench Canadian Conservative MP than with the actual Prime Minister of Canada, who was sitting across the negotiating table. Vance dismissed Pierre Poilievre, the leader of Canada's official opposition, the man who would be Prime Minister if the Conservatives won an election, as a non-entity in the negotiations. He praised the random MP instead. This framing had political implications inside Canada that the American side may not have fully calculated. Jivani's relationship with Vance had already attracted attention in Canada, and not entirely positive attention. Earlier in the trade war, Jivani had made comments to a right-wing news outlet describing Canadians' reaction to Trump's tariff threats as an anti-American hissy fit, language that went over extremely badly in a country that had been experiencing genuine economic pain from the tariffs, and that had organized a sustained grassroots boycott of American goods as an expression of national resistance. Poilievre had distanced himself from Jivani's comments at the time, saying, "Jivani speaks for himself and I speak for the party." And now, in the leaked Vance audio, the Vice President of the United States was publicly elevating the backbench Conservative MP, who had called Canadian concerns a hissy fit, while dismissing both the actual Prime Minister and the actual leader of the opposition. The political optics inside Canada were not favorable to the American position. The timing of the audio's publication, on Thursday, the day after the fundraiser, while negotiations were still ongoing, created the specific political dynamic that made Vance's comments so consequential. Carney was still at the table. His negotiators were still in Washington. The deal was still theoretically possible, and Canadian voters were waking up on Thursday morning to read that the American vice president had been mocking their prime minister at a private fundraiser in the Hamptons, calling his toughness hilarious and suggesting he always climbed down. The public reaction in Canada was immediate and intense. The mockery confirmed for many Canadians the narrative that they had already internalized through 18 months of trade war, that the American side did not respect Canada as an equal partner, that it viewed Canadian resistance as theatrical rather than genuine, and that Washington expected Ottawa to fold regardless of whatever public posture it adopted. That perception had political consequences for Carney, but not the ones Vance might have anticipated. It did not weaken Carney's domestic position by exposing his concessions. It strengthened it by making any further concessions politically impossible. A prime minister who has just been publicly mocked by the American vice president for climbing down too much cannot then be seen to climb down further. The Canadian political reality, the parliament he leads, the premiers he needs to manage, the public that elected him in an election that was largely fought on the question of how to stand up to American economic pressure, made additional concessions in the immediate aftermath of the Vance audio essentially untenable. Whatever space had existed for Canada to accept the American terms that were on the table had been significantly narrowed by Vance's comments becoming public at the worst possible moment. The mockery that was supposed to be private had become public, and public mockery of a leader who is still at the negotiating table changes the political calculation of what that leader can accept without appearing to validate the mockery. This is the mechanism by which Vance's comments at a Hamptons fundraiser became a contributing factor to the breakdown of the negotiations they were supposedly commenting on. Not because Carney was emotionally wounded by being called a very sweet guy, but because the leak transformed the political environment in which the final hours of negotiation were conducted. The Canadian negotiators, sitting across from their American counterparts on Friday, knew that their boss had been publicly characterized as someone who always climbs down. The Canadian public watching the negotiations knew it too. The 10 provincial premiers whose agreement was needed for certain elements of any deal knew it. And the domestic political cost of a deal that could be framed, as Vance had already framed the pre-collapse version, as Canada, climbing down again, became higher in the hours between the audio becoming public and the midnight deadline arriving. Carney's response to the Vance audio was measured in its public form, but devastating in its effect. He said the deal had become untenable because the United States had asked too much and offered too little. That phrase, asked too much and offered too little, is the precise inversion of the Vance narrative. Vance said Canada climbed down and got less than it should have. Carney said the United States demanded more than was reasonable and delivered less than was fair. Two characterizations of the same negotiation pointing in exactly opposite directions, each one calibrated for its domestic political audience, but only one of them was accompanied by an action that backed it up. Vance said his piece at a fundraiser in the Hamptons and moved on. Carney suspended the negotiations, recalled his negotiators, and imposed retaliatory tariffs. Words backed by action carry a different weight than words alone. The Giovanni subplot acquired one more dimension after the audio became public and the negotiations collapsed. If Vance had been suggesting that the conservative opposition channel, Giovanni's quiet advocacy in Washington, was an effective alternative to the official government channel, the collapse of the official negotiation that Giovanni's American connections were supposed to help facilitate is itself a commentary on the limits of that strategy. Back-channel diplomacy through personal relationships can supplement official negotiations. It cannot substitute for them. And the suggestion embedded in Vance's comments that the American side found it more productive to work with a friendly conservative backbencher than with the actual government of Canada was, beyond its diplomatic presumptuousness, practically ineffective. The negotiations collapsed anyway. The tariffs went on anyway. The retaliatory measures came anyway. The friendly Yale connection did not produce a deal. The leak itself is worth examining because leaks of this kind rarely happen accidentally, and the consequences of this one were significant enough to raise questions about what the leaking source intended, a source who attended a private Republican fundraiser in Southampton obtained audio of the vice president's remarks and provided it to the Canadian press, the Canadian National Wire Service, whose content reaches every major news outlet in Canada. The source's identity has not been disclosed, their motivation is not known, but the consequences of the leak, the publication of Vance's mockery of Carney at the precise moment of maximum sensitivity in the negotiations, were entirely predictable, and they were consequences that any sophisticated political actor would have understood before deciding to share the audio. Someone at that fundraiser decided that Canadians needed to know what the American vice president had said about their prime minister. The downstream consequences of that decision shaped the final hours of the negotiation that then collapsed. The Poilievre dimension deserves its own examination because Vance's dismissal of Canada's conservative leader as a non-entity reveals something about how Washington was thinking about Canadian politics that may not have been accurate. Pierre Poilievre had led the Conservative Party of Canada to official opposition status and had been consistently leading in national polling throughout the trade war period. In a different political environment, without the national unity dynamic that Trump's aggressive rhetoric toward Canada created, Poilievre might well have been prime minister by now. But Trump's annexation comments, his repeated reference to Canadian prime ministers as governors, and his aggressive tariff strategy had the effect of collapsing the normal partisan divisions in Canadian politics around the question of how to respond to American pressure. The trade war became a national question rather than a partisan one, and Carney, who had run explicitly on the platform of standing up to Trump, benefited electorally from the dynamics that Trump's own behavior created. Vance dismissing Poilievre as a non-entity while elevating Giovanni reflected a Washington assessment of Canadian politics that prioritized personal relationships with friendly figures over accurate mapping of the actual political landscape. The Conservative Party, whose leader Vance called a non-entity, is the official opposition with significant seats in Parliament and real influence over Canada's political direction, dismissing it in favor of a relationship with a single backbench MP, however personally close that MP might be to the Vice President, represented a misreading of Canadian political geography that may have contributed to American miscalculations about how much flexibility Carney actually had and how the Canadian domestic audience would respond to the negotiating dynamics. What the Vance episode ultimately illustrates, in its full arc from the Hamptons, fundraiser to the midnight collapse, is the gap between how the American side was reading the Canadian political situation and how that situation actually worked. Washington read Carney as someone who performs toughness, but ultimately folds. The leaked audio said so explicitly, hilarious, climbs down. The Canadian public read the same audio and concluded that Carney needed to not fold. The domestic political consequence of Vance's mockery becoming public was to make folding politically impossible for Carney in a way that it might not have been if the comments had stayed private. The mockery intended to characterize Canadian capitulation instead contributed to preventing it. To understand why the American reading of Canada was so consistently off throughout this entire confrontation, you have to understand something about the history of how Washington has traditionally thought about its northern neighbor, and why that historical framework stopped being accurate somewhere around February 2025 and never recovered. For most of the post-war era, Canada's relationship with the United States operated on a set of unspoken assumptions that both sides largely accepted. Canada was the junior partner. Canada needed the American market more than the American market needed Canada. Canadian governments might complain publicly about American trade practices, might occasionally impose retaliatory measures to satisfy domestic political audiences, but would ultimately reach accommodations that preserve the fundamental relationship, because the cost of not doing so was too high for Canada to sustain. This pattern had played out enough times, through the softwood lumber disputes, through the beef trade conflicts, through various agricultural irritants, that it had calcified into Washington's working assumption about how Canada always behaved. Loudly resistant at the start, quietly pragmatic at the end, always, fundamentally, manageable. What Washington failed to account for was the specific way in which Trump's second-term approach to Canada had crossed a threshold that previous trade confrontations had not crossed. It was not simply the tariff rates, though the rates were punishing. It was the annexation comments, the 51st state rhetoric, the repeated references to Canadian prime ministers as governors, the suggestion, deployed casually and repeatedly at the highest level of the American government, that Canada's sovereignty was negotiable, that it existed at American sufferance rather than as an inviolable fact. That rhetoric did something to Canadian public opinion that tariff rates alone could never have done. It transformed the trade war from an economic dispute into an identity question. And identity questions produce a different kind of political response than economic disputes. Economic disputes get resolved when the pain threshold is reached, and a compromise becomes preferable to continued conflict. Identity questions can harden into positions that economic logic alone cannot soften, because the cost of appearing to capitulate on an identity question is political in a way that the cost of an economic concession is not. Carney understood this dynamic from the moment he entered the race to succeed Justin Trudeau. His campaign was built explicitly around the proposition that Canada needed different leadership for a different kind of confrontation. That the moment called for someone with the economic credibility, the international standing, and the personal temperament to engage Trump's America on terms of genuine equality rather than managed deference. He won the Liberal leadership and then the general election substantially on that platform. The Canadian voters who put him in office did not elect him to find a comfortable compromise. They elected him to hold the line. And the Vance audio, by publicly characterizing Carney's line-holding as hilarious theater that always dissolved into capitulation, handed Carney the clearest possible confirmation of what holding the line actually meant in practice. Not holding it until a reasonable deal appeared, holding it past the point where the American side expected the fold, holding it through the midnight deadline, and past it into the retaliatory measures that the American side said would trigger further escalation. The question of what Carney gains domestically from the table turning that the Vance leak enabled is worth examining honestly, because domestic political calculation is always part of the picture in these confrontations, regardless of how principled the public framing is. A Carney, who had signed a deal in the final hours before midnight, a deal that the American vice president had already characterized as Canada climbing down, would have returned to Ottawa with a politically complicated outcome. The deal might have been economically reasonable, it might have protected significant Canadian interests, but the narrative around it, shaped partly by Vance's own framing, would have been one of Canadian retreat. A Carney who suspended negotiations, recalled his team, and matched tariffs dollar for dollar returns to Ottawa with a different political narrative entirely. He stood firm. He refused unfair last-minute American demands. He matched their pressure with Canadian pressure. That narrative is significantly more useful to a prime minister who built his political identity around not being pushed around by Washington. The economic cost of that narrative is real, and Carney knows it better than almost anyone, given his background as a central banker who has spent a career thinking about macroeconomic consequences. 50% tariffs on $28 billion of Canadian exports are not a political abstraction. They are a concrete economic impact landing on specific industries, specific workers, and specific communities whose economic health depends on American market access. The auto workers in Windsor, the lumber producers in British Columbia, the agricultural exporters in the prairies. These are not people who benefit from the political narrative of Canadian toughness. They are people who need a functioning trade relationship with the United States to sustain their livelihoods. Carney's calculation that the long-term negotiating position of Canada is better served by refusing an inadequate deal than by accepting one that the American vice president has already publicly characterized as Canadian capitulation is a genuine strategic judgment that reasonable people can assess differently. It is not costless. The costs are real, and they are being paid by real people right now. The path forward from the Vance-Carney confrontation is also shaped by what the audio revealed about the personal dynamics at the highest levels of the bilateral relationship. Vance described getting along quite well with Carney personally, calling him a very sweet guy while mocking his negotiating posture. That distinction between personal regard and political contempt is itself revealing. It suggests a relationship where the American side likes and respects the Canadian leader as a person while fundamentally underestimating him as a political actor. That underestimation has now been corrected in the most direct possible way. Whatever assumptions Vance and the broader Trump circle held about Carney's willingness to fold when sufficiently pressured have been replaced by the concrete evidence of what actually happened when the pressure reached its maximum. He did not fold. He escalated. And the recalibration of American expectations that must now follow, if the relationship is to be managed productively going forward, begins from a baseline of demonstrated Canadian willingness to absorb the cost of confrontation rather than accept inadequate terms. Whether that recalibration produces better American offers when negotiations eventually resume, or whether it produces further escalation as the Trump administration concludes that Canada must be pressed harder before it yields, is the central unknown that now defines the trajectory of the most consequential bilateral relationship in North American history. The Hamptons fundraiser started it. The midnight deadline ended one chapter, and the next chapter has not yet been written. Vance said it was hilarious that Carney tried to out-tough Trump. Then, Carney suspended negotiations, recalled his team, and matched 50%. Tariffs, dollar for dollar. The man Vance called a very sweet guy who always climbed down did not climb down. He walked out. Whatever Vance found hilarious on Wednesday evening in Southampton was considerably less funny by Friday night in Ottawa. The tables had turned, not because of any single dramatic confrontation or clever tactical maneuver, but because the private mockery became public at exactly the wrong moment for the side doing the mocking, in front of exactly the audience it was most likely to harden against further concession. Leaked audio from a Hampton fundraiser changed the politics of a midnight deadline in ways that no one in that room anticipated. And the man who was the subject of the laughter had the last word, not at a fundraiser, but in the policy consequence that will reshape North American trade for the foreseeable future. Canada will match those tariffs dollar for dollar. Not so hilarious now.